let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome everyone to our MedSchoolCoach MCAT webinar. Today we're going to be providing all of you with a lot of really fantastic information about how to prepare for the MCAT exam. So as I can see from this poll, which I'm going to go ahead and end it right now and share the results, it's actually pretty impressive. We have almost an equal number of you for each of these answer choices. So I can see a number of you are planning on taking the MCAT quite soon, so possibly March, April, or May. A lot of you are also looking at the summer, and the rest of you are really getting started early, planning on taking the MCAT next year or later on. Okay, so let's get started with this presentation. My name is Ken. I am the Director of MCAT Programming with the MedSchoolCoach. With me today, we have two of our fantastic MCAT tutors. Rishav and Catherine, do you each want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, guys. I'm Rishav. I graduated from Duke University in 2016. Since then, I've been working as a Teach America teacher, and I'll be starting med school this fall. I haven't decided where yet, but I know I'll be starting this fall.
Great, and nice to meet you all. My name is Catherine, and I graduated from the University of Miami in 2018, and I'm currently applying this cycle to medical school, so I'm excited to get the process started.
All right, fantastic. Thank you both. So both Rishav and Catherine, of course, got some of the highest MCAT scores in the entire nation. So they will really have a plethora of information to provide all of you today. Please note that we do have a Q&A option with this online platform with Zoom. So feel free to type in any questions that you have throughout this presentation. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to have a roundtable Q&A where we're going to go ahead and answer a lot of the questions that you will have. So here's just an outline for today. So we're going to be talking about how to design an effective study plan, some tips and strategies for getting the high scores, how to prevent burnout, and also talking a bit about what is the importance of the MCAT in admissions for medical school, what type of score do you want to be aiming for to secure an acceptance, and then we'll talk a bit about how MedSchoolCoach can help you prepare for the MCAT exam, and of course, we'll wrap up with the Q&A at the end. So, first of all, the MCAT exam. For those of you who are not familiar with the MCAT, you should know that the MCAT has 4 sections: the Chem Phys section, the Cars section, the Biochem section, and the Psych-Soc section. Each of these sections have an individual score between 118 to 132. 125 is an average score. So for a student that gets an average score in all 4 sections of the exam, that gives them a perfect 500. Now, this makes it easy for medical schools to look at a student's MCAT score and say the student is above average or below average. Other parts of the MCAT you want to be familiar with: this exam contains both passage-based questions and freestanding questions. So this actually makes the MCAT unique among the pre-health exams. And here I'm comparing it with the PCAT, the DAT, the OAT, which are for pharmacy school, dental school, and optometry school. Those exams only have freestanding questions. So they're really based solely on, does the student know the scientific content or not? As you're going to see, the MCAT is a bit more of a challenging exam because in addition to knowing the scientific content, students are going to have to be able to apply their knowledge of science to new situations introduced in these passages on the exam. And a couple other important details: the exam is a multiple choice exam. Every question is worth the same amount of points, and there is also no guessing penalty. Okay. Now, before I hand it off to Rishav as well as Catherine to talk about their fantastic tips, I do want to talk about the importance of the MCAT in admissions. As many of you have probably heard before, admissions for medical school requires a rather extensive application, and the way that the medical school admissions committees evaluate the applications is quite comprehensive, which means your GPA is important, your MCAT is important, but so is your personal statements, your letters of recommendation, your experiences, including research, clinical, volunteer, leadership, and more, as well as honors and awards. And while all of these are important, for getting an acceptance letter to medical school, it is important to note that of all of these different factors, they are all really subjective with the exception of the MCAT as well as the GPA. So both of these are numbers and they are filterable. And there are some medical schools that do have filters when it comes to GPA and the MCAT, so that is important to keep in mind. Okay, so before we actually jump into some of the tips and advice we're going to provide you, I actually want to set up another poll here. So let me go ahead and launch the second poll. So all of you can go ahead and respond to this. The question is, which section of the exam are you most concerned about? All right, very good. So let's see what we have. We have a lot for the Chem Phys section, a good amount for cars, and a few for the Biochem and Psych Soc. I would say that these responses are perfectly reasonable. The Chem Phys section can be a very intimidating section for exams since this is the section that tests the most subjects. It has 30% general chemistry, 25% biochemistry, 25% physics, 15% organic chemistry, and 5% biology. It really is combining all of the different subjects on the exam. The cars section, of course, this intimidates a lot of students as well. This is a unique section that doesn't require any science content knowledge at all. It's really testing your ability to read texts about social studies and the humanities and answer questions about them. So great. So now moving on, we're going to go ahead and have Rashab take over here. He's going to provide all of you some fantastic tips about scoring well on the exam.
Hi guys, so these are some of the tips that I wish I had when I was studying for the MCAT. Okay, so my first tip to you is that you should have multiple passes through the same material when you're studying. Now, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that seeing something once, especially if you're trying to learn it for retention over many, many months, is not enough. And so that means that you have to be studying the same things multiple times. And I think there are a couple good ways to do this, and I think they should be built into the study plan that you create for yourself. And so one way that some students will handle this is that every day, the beginning of their studying will be some kind of review, whether it's going through notes that they took the previous week or throughout the week this last week, or watching videos on topics that they're struggling with. I think another good way to do this is, and this is what I did, is that I had a day every week, and for me it was Sunday, that was just dedicated to review. And so every Sunday, instead of covering new material, I would go back and review the material that I'd covered the month before, or the week before, 2 weeks before. So I was seeing the stuff that was difficult for me over and over again, and that I wouldn't forget it. Something else that I think is a really great idea is that there's going to be stuff that you encounter when you're studying for the MCAT that doesn't make sense. And sometimes the reason it doesn't make sense is not because you can't learn it. In fact, it's really the case. It's because the resource that you were using wasn't the one that was right for you. And so if there's something that doesn't make sense, don't try and sit there and use the same resource over and over again. Try another one. There's a lot of really wonderful resources online. Khan Academy is one that I often have my students try if reading something didn't make sense, to watch a video on it. And if you read it, if you've done problems on it, if you watch videos on it and still doesn't make sense, I think it's a really great idea to go ask somebody, whether it's a friend, a tutor, a teacher, if they could clarify that concept for you. And I think the last thing, and this is something that really helped me a lot, is that there are certain high yield topics that you're going to encounter on the MCAT that you should go ahead and memorize often. And so for me, that meant every day for the last month of my studying, there were some things that I knew that I wanted to review. And so every day I would review amino acids, I would review Krebs, glycolysis, gluconeogenesis. I might review my physics formulas. I know that those things are things that I just need to commit to memory and I need to be seeing over and over again so I don't forget them. So that's my first tip to you. The second tip is that you should really make the most out of the practice materials that you have. And in fact, there is a set of questions that were written by the AAMC, that's the organization that writes the MCAT, that they provide to us. And these are really the best questions that you can use to study for the MCAT, because they're the most representative of what you should be seeing when you take the actual exam. When you do these, and so by the way, you should really center your practice around these questions. I know some students do a lot of like Princeton Review questions or Kaplan questions, and they're really not the best. These are the ones that you want to be focusing on when you do your studying. And when you do these questions, you want to simulate the actual testing conditions that you're going to encounter on your test date. The MCAT is a 7.5 hour long marathon. And in addition to testing your ability to read and understand science, it's really testing your ability to pace yourself, to focus for 7.5 hours, to build the endurance to take an exam like that. And so you should be testing yourself the way that you'll be tested on exam day. That means if you're doing a full-length exam, wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning, have breakfast, and get started around 8:30. If you're doing practice problems, make sure you're timing yourself the same way that you time yourself on the MCAT. So 95 minutes for 59 questions on the science sections. In addition to that, once you're done taking the exam, you should be spending at least as much time reviewing that exam that you just took or the questions that you just did as you actually spent doing the questions. In addition to just getting practice, these questions are really useful because, when you're studying over months and months and months, sometimes there can be something that you studied maybe, like 2 months ago that you don't remember. And you don't know what those gaps are yet until you start doing practice questions. And so one of the purposes of the practice questions is to identify the things that you forgot and the gaps that you have in your content knowledge. And so without reviewing the questions and identifying those gaps and addressing them, those questions aren't going to help you improve your score very much. And lastly, you shouldn't just look at the questions that you got incorrectly. Almost inevitably, there's going to be a set of questions that you took that you did in the exam where you got the right answer, but you may not have actually understood the correct logic. Or you got the right answer because you guessed, or you got the right answer because you used process of elimination, but you didn't know why the actual answer was correct. And so make sure you look at the questions you got wrong, but also go back and look at every single question that you weren't completely sure on when you took the exam. And in fact, if you can, you should go back and look at every single question all over again. And my last tip to you is that, and I think this is the most important thing, that you need to develop a really disciplined study schedule for yourself, and you have to find a way to stick to it. For me, this was really difficult because I was working a full-time job, coming home at like 5, 6 p.m. every day, and then I really didn't want to study when I got home. And so for me, having a really disciplined work ethic and disciplined schedule was, I think, the key to getting a good score. And so for many students, that means that you want to start studying earlier than you think you need to. That for most of my students, they might estimate that it'll take them, a certain amount, they'll be at this chapter by this date or something. And almost inevitably, there are going to be things that come up that kind of delay you. They're going to be like, you're going to have days when you're sick. You're going to have days when your boss asks you to do something in last minute. And so you want to make sure you have built-in time into that schedule in case you have to delay your studying. I think in addition to that, you want to make sure that you have this like built-in study block every single day that you're going to be studying, and then find a way to make sure that you're actually studying during that block. And so in my case, I knew that every day, on the weekdays, I'd come home at 6, I'd take a break, and around 7:30, I'd start studying. And so that meant that I had alarms that were started ringing at like 7 p.m. and then 7:15 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. to let me know that I need to start studying. And if that didn't work, I would have my girlfriend or my friends or my parents text me to remind me that I need to start studying. But whatever it is, make sure you have a set time, and then create these accountability mechanisms to make sure that you stick to those times that you're going to study. In addition to that, I think for me, one of the hardest things about getting started on studying was I didn't know what I should be doing every day. And so a way to fix that is to just, before you even start studying, have a calendar that's ready that tells you what you need to be doing every single day. That that when you come home today, that you're responsible for doing these practice problems, reviewing these concepts, watching these videos, reading this text. And if you know what you're responsible for every single day, I think it makes it a lot more easy to get started on your studying and to know when you're done studying for that day. And I think the last thing that you should remember is that you shouldn't take the exam until you feel ready. That if you study the right way, that means you've done multiple full-length exams written by the AAMC. You should have a clear idea on test day of what your score is going to be. It might fluctuate a little bit, but you should have an idea of where you're scoring. And if that score that you're estimating at that point is not a score that you can live with, then you shouldn't be taking the exam that day. And if you did it right, if you planned in advance and built in some extra time into your study schedule, that means that you might that you might have to push back your exam a little bit, but that's okay, because in the end of the day, like, you want to be taking the exam knowing confidently that you're going to get the score that you want. And I think those are the tips that I wish I had known when I was studying for the MCAT. Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, Rishabh. And of course, all fantastic points. And really, just to echo this last point, it really is quite important to wait until you are ready to take the MCAT exam. We frequently have students that come to us that are looking for help, and very often when we ask them if they took practice scores or took practice tests, they'll say yes. And we ask, were you scoring around your target score on their practice tests? And some of them will say no, that they were scoring, a number of points below their target scores. And their hope was that, well, I was hoping that I'd get lucky on test day and do well, but usually that's not the case for most students. Again, as Rishabh mentioned, the AAMC has released full-length practice tests, and these are all questions from previous MCAT exams. So they're very good for emulating your actual test day and seeing what you might actually get on your exam. So definitely make sure that you are getting the scores you want on your practice test scores before you take the exam. Okay, so now let's pass it on to Catherine, if you want to go ahead and take over.
Yeah, great. So hello again, everyone. I'm really excited to give you all of my tips. So I'll be talking a lot about first preventing burnout. So we'll get started there. So the reason I put this here is because you need to be able to hold yourself accountable to your study schedule. So a lot of times I have students who plan chapters upon chapters every single day, and it's just not attainable. You need to make sure that you set a plan that you can really hold yourself to. So this means being realistic about the fact that you're in fact a human being and you're not an MCAT robot. So you do need breaks, you need time off, you need to spend time with your friends. So that should be a part of your holistic study schedule. So the days off really give yourself something to look forward to, and therefore your study time can be focused and motivated by that day off goal that you have in mind. So in addition to that, you do want to have a lighter course load during your MCAT studies. Or if it's impossible for you to do that, I do recommend that you spread out your studies over a much longer period than you'd actually expect. So things really happen, schoolwork builds up very quickly over the semester, and it gets overwhelming to hold yourself accountable to your MCAT goals. So I recommend doing it over the summer, or definitely just having a lighter course load during that time. All right. And then my second tip is to not let materials slip through the cracks. And by this, I mean those difficult topics that you just seemingly want to study once and completely forget about. So unfortunately, the MCAT will sneak up on you and test you on the things that you really hoped that they wouldn't. So to prepare yourself for this, take notes on the things that you don't understand on your first read and review it later. So you should plan out days, just like Rishabh said, where you go and do a thorough review of all the topics that are extremely challenging for you, and you want to turn those into your strengths. So I recommend, especially for math or physics topics, if something is just not clicking, start out each day with a practice problem on that topic. That will really get you thinking about it and start cultivating that mastery that you need to do well on the exam and even surpass your own expectations. Okay, and then we'll move on to my last tip, which is to develop confidence and mastery. So the MCAT isn't testing your ability to recall the right answer just from your memory and that's it. It's a critical thinking exam. So you want to be able to develop confidence that you're making the right calls when thinking about complex problems, synthesizing information from passages, and altogether just reasoning in ways that you weren't forced to do in your undergraduate classes. So if you have difficult practice, like Rishabh said, there's a bunch of great materials from the AAMC, and also other test prep companies have their own materials because you want to save the AAMC for last. So really build in some difficult practice, and it'll make it a lot easier when you're taking an AAMC exam. Next is to work with active study methods. So neurological research has really shown that the the more senses that you incorporate into your learning, the more likely you are to retain the information. So using auditory information, using your hands, using written study sheets with pictures, all of these can be great ways to build your understanding of complex topics. So if you can start from a blank sheet of paper and build up a beautiful picture of a concept, that's when you really know that you've mastered the topic. And finally, if there's a difficult question, especially for the Chem Phys section, which I know a lot of you were concerned about, definitely work through the problem, create a detailed list of how you could explain this to someone else, and maybe even try it out. If you have a private place or you have a friend who's also studying, just go ahead and talk out loud. That'll help really build your confidence in the exam.
All right, so thank you both for those tips. So now that we've talked a bit about what are these ways that you can help, that you can keep in mind as you start thinking about preparing for your exam, I do want to discuss what is a good MCAT score, right? Ultimately, at some point, it's going to be important to know what is a good score you should be aiming for when you're studying for an exam. And if you recall earlier, I said that the average score for each section of the exam is 125. So that means in total, an average score is a 500. As you might imagine, 500 is probably not great for applying to medical schools. And here we actually have a table which has data from the AAMC about the GPA and MCAT scores of applicants as well as matriculants. So you can see in this chart, we have these different GPA and MCAT combinations, and you can see what is the percentage of applicants with the respective GPA and MCAT scores. What was the percentage of those applicants that got accepted? For instance, we can see that students who had a GPA between 3.6 and 3.79 and an MCAT score of 506 to 509 had a 49% chance of getting admitted to medical school. And of course, you can see the higher your numbers, the higher your chances of getting accepted. But even at, the highest numbers, so above a 379 GPA, above a 517 MCAT, chances of admission is still not guaranteed. So that's why you want to know, while GPA and MCAT are important, the other aspects of your application are also important to keep in mind. But focusing on the numbers, it is important to note that you can see if your numbers are very low, there are certainly situations where, regardless of how fantastic your experiences are, your chances of getting in are just not fantastic. Another question that we often get from students is, between the GPA and the MCAT, is it possible for one to make up for the other, right? And you can see that if you have a high GPA, well, you can get away with a lower MCAT score and possibly still get admitted. But what if we're looking at the opposite situation? If you have a low GPA, can you still get in if you have a high MCAT score? And if you actually look at the colors here, where you have students with a high MCAT score and low GPA, you can actually get pretty high percentages. So students with a 3.0 to 3.19, if they're able to get a high MCAT score above 517, they can get a pretty good percentage chance of getting into medical school compared to a student who did very well in school, but not very well on the MCAT. So when you look at this table, both GPA and MCAT are important, but you can also take note that if you have a low GPA, it is possible for the MCAT to essentially help you out a little bit. Okay, now before we go on to the next slide, I do want to throw up another poll. So let's go ahead and put this here, and we'll give you all a few moments to answer this real quick. The question is, how do you plan on studying for the MCAT? And of course, several of you who are taking the MCAT this spring are currently already studying. So you are certainly going to be very busy for the next few months. And actually, while we're waiting for this poll, Catherine and Rashad, do you each want to describe how you each study for the MCAT? Rashad, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think my case was kind of unique. I actually studied twice, and after the first time, I didn't actually take the MCAT. So I took a Princeton Review in-person course while I was an undergrad over the summer, and I like I did the whole course, but I didn't really feel that prepared. I didn't feel like I learned that much from that course. And then I ended up taking a couple of gap years. And so 2 years after college, I actually started self-studying. I had a set of textbooks. I started reading a set of textbooks myself, and I thought I learned better when I did that. I used my AMC questions as my centerpiece for my practice questions. And I was studying while I was working full time. So I was working as a teacher, coming home around like 4 or 5 p.m. every day, doing a bunch of grading and lesson planning. And then I would study in the evenings whenever I could. And so that's how I studied. And I spent about, someone had asked, I think in the questions, how long did you study for? I spent about 3.5 months studying.
Okay, great. So I'll talk a little bit about how I studied for the MCAT. So kind of like Rishav, I did study for the MCAT twice. So I thought I was going to go into medical school right after undergrad. So I decided that the best time to study would be the summer after my sophomore year. And it turns out that I just wasn't ready and I didn't understand what I was getting myself into. So I tried self-studying. I got Kaplan books. I read a few chapters, got overwhelmed, and I just didn't really understand how much practice I needed for the MCAT. So I decided to postpone until after my junior year, and then I felt extremely ready. So I got the Next Step course, and that's what I used, and I basically self-studied, but they do have videos and kind of a study plan set up, but I kind of made my own study plan once I got sick of theirs. But basically I started studying in March. I studied part-time, and then I studied until August, so from May until August full-time. So I definitely dedicated a lot of time to the MCAT, and I'm sure that's why I did so well.
All right, thank you both. So see what we have. So we have a lot for self-study, and then basically downwards from there, MCAT prep course, tutoring, and onshore. Again, all of this is perfectly reasonable, as you heard from both Catherine and Rishav. They essentially had sort of a combination, right? Some self-study as well as prep courses. So it's very common for students to use these different routes. And certainly there are a lot of students who do fantastic on the exam through self-studies, through MCAT courses, and of course with MCAT tutoring as well. So what I want to talk about then for the next few slides is a bit about how the MedSchoolCoach can help you with your MCAT preparation. So first of all, the MedSchoolCoach's MCAT program is a combination of tutoring as well as an MCAT video course. So in terms of our tutors, as you can guess from Rishav and Catherine, we have some of the best MCAT tutors out there. Our requirements for our tutors are extremely high, that all of our tutors must have scored between 130 to 132 on each section of the exam that they tutor. So our tutors have done fantastic on the exam. They've taken the actual exam, so they know what it takes to score well on the exam. Another important component of our MCAT program is we provide an MCAT video course. This video course was built completely for the new MCAT exam. So you'll see a lot of test prep companies out there who essentially recycled a lot of their practice materials from the old MCAT before 2015 and just kept using it for the new MCAT. And it really hasn't worked out as well for students. So with this course that's brand new for the new MCAT and also designed by MCAT students that did, or MCAT scores that did phenomenal on the exam, it's a great course. The next thing about MCAT tutoring is really thinking about how this is able to help students. So there are several things I want to discuss here. So the first aspect is that it's personalized. So when you're studying for the MCAT, you recognize that you are different as a pre-medical student from all other pre-medical students. So each student has their strengths and weaknesses as well as their own goals. And we have literally seen it all. So we've seen the average pre-medical student who is looking to take the MCAT in their junior or senior year of college, or they've just graduated and they're taking a gap year or two. Many of these students have fairly straightforward situations. They've taken all of the prerequisite courses for the MCAT. But we also have students with different situations. So students who are career changers, so non-traditional students. We have students who took on different careers for 5, 10, or even 20 years and then decided they wanted to switch over to medicine, as well as students who wanted to start their MCAT prep very early. We have students that have come to us that just started college in the fall in their freshman year and are already thinking about preparing for the MCAT. So for all of these different students, they all require different study plans. So the nice thing about tutoring is we can create a study plan just for that student. The next part is our tutors are fantastic. So when you think about studying for the MCAT, there's always going to be some content that you never understood that well in college, right? Even if you got A's in all of your classes, there's always some topics that you never understood that well. And in many cases, you can look up these topics online, look them up on Google or YouTube and look up videos. And that sometimes will work. And when it works, sometimes it'll take a long time. So it might take you 2 to 3 hours just to figure out a fairly simple topic until you understand it. The nice thing about working with a tutor is the tutor can just teach that concept to you in 10 to 15 minutes. So essentially it allows you to study a lot more efficiently without having to spend so much time having to learn and figure out the material on your own. The next part is focusing on you and your weaknesses. So before we said that, students are going to have all sorts of different backgrounds, and a lot of that was based on their stage or their age as a pre-medical student. But beyond that, thinking beyond the content background of students, you might think, oh, some students did well in certain subjects in their pre-medical courses and not so well in other courses. We can certainly help with those, but there are other types of weaknesses that students have. For instance, some students are slow readers. Some students are slow test takers. Some students have testing anxiety. Some students have various degrees of learning disabilities, right? Each of these students might have different and unique weaknesses. And again, having worked with so many students at this point, we are able to design a study plan that caters to each student's weaknesses. And of course, the nice thing about working with tutors is you know you're working with a team that knows what they're doing, and that in itself will help provide confidence as you're working for your MCAT exam. So the last thing I want to discuss then is how MCAT tutoring works with the MedSchoolCoach. So when you sign up for tutoring with the MedSchoolCoach, you'll be paired with one of our MCAT tutors based on availability and requirements. We make sure that our tutors have plenty of time to dedicate to your MCAT preparation, that they are there to support you throughout the entire process, and that the tutor is able to fulfill your needs as a student. Then our tutoring sessions will involve a variety of different types of sessions. We can help students with content. So if a student is very weak in a particular subject, we can help teach that content to you, especially for students that haven't taken all of their MCAT prerequisite courses. This is very helpful. We can also help with strategies and techniques, so helping you to figure out the questions that you missed. Why are you missing those questions? And what do you have to do so you don't miss those questions again? And the last thing I do want to mention is, of course, so far, our students have done quite fantastic on the MCAT. And today is actually a great day to mention this because today, MCAT scores came out for a number of students who took the test in January. And we're getting lots of happy emails. So lots of students that are happy with their scores after prepping with us. So that's great. So just one last thing, of course, the satisfaction guarantee. We do want to make sure that our students are happy with us. At any point, if a student is unhappy with the tutor that they're working with, we're happy to switch the tutor to another tutor until the student is happy with who they're working with. Also, if you're not happy with our program, we'll be more than happy to refund you your unused hours. And of course, if your MCAT score doesn't actually end up improving after working with us, we will continue working with you for free. Although I will note at this point, we have not had a single student actually come to us asking to redeem this. So far we've been doing pretty well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave the rest of the session for Q&A. We do have several questions, but again, if you have additional questions that you want to ask, please feel free to type them in the Q&A and we'll go ahead and start answering them. So let's see, we have a question here. I think Rashad was answering this a bit. Catherine, do you want to respond this to perhaps a little bit more detail? The question is, how much time should I spend preparing for the exam? Some students recommend 2 to 3 months before the exam. Is that enough?
Okay, great. So this is an excellent question, and it really depends on the student. So if you're someone who has a lot of time to dedicate to your studies, so if you're prepping full time, 2 to 3 months is golden. You definitely have enough time to prepare for the exam if you're putting in, say, 6 or more hours per day. However, if you're a student who is in school right now, that might not be the best fit for you because, as I mentioned earlier, you definitely need to have time for yourself so you don't burn out. So this becomes a problem when things fall by the wayside because you realize that you can't hold yourself to full-time school and full-time MCAT studying for 2 to 3 months. So this would be reasonable over the summer, but I really wouldn't recommend this during the school year. I think you should spread it out over a number of months in that case.
All right, and we have a couple of quick questions. So one is, if you have taken the MCAT 3 times, would that cause problems with admissions? Would it filter you out? So this one I'll answer real quick. So when it comes to the MCAT, it is best to take the exam the fewest times possible, which means the best score is 1 score. But that being said, it is okay to retake the MCAT. I would say probably half of all pre-medical students end up retaking the exam. So it is extremely common for students to retake the MCAT, but just be aware that the more times you take the exam, if you take it more than 3 times, it starts to potentially be a red flag for medical schools when it comes to admissions. However, that being said, if you are able to improve your score significantly, then you can demonstrate to medical schools that you do know your content well and you do have the critical thinking skills to score well on exams. So I would say if you have 3 scores already that you aren't happy with, if you can get a 4th score that is 10 points higher, then I would say that would be fine. We have another question here about, do you know how accommodations work for the MCAT for those who have health issues? So again, I'll answer this one real quick. So the MCAT does provide accommodations for students with varying health issues. So some of these could refer to various learning disabilities that would require the students to have time and a half or double time, or be able to take the exam in a quiet environment, essentially by themselves. The main thing I'll say here is that if you are looking for accommodations on your MCAT, make sure to apply for this early because the process for applying for accommodations with AMC takes a long time. It takes months, and often they won't tell you whether or not your accommodations will be granted until a month or so before your test date. So really try to submit your paperwork for accommodations as soon as you can. Okay, so let's see, another question we have here. Rashad, if you want to take this one, is there any effective way for non-traditional students to do long-term studying? And they mentioned, I plan to take a few gap years to build my resume.
Yeah, I'd love to take that. So I actually ended up taking 3 gap years. And for me, I think there's a couple things that helped. I think creating a calendar very early on, so that I knew kind of how my studying would go month to month to month, having a date in mind, a target date for the MCAT, and planning around that. I think I had mentioned earlier that for me, the most difficult thing about someone who's working and studying for the MCAT is that you really have to balance what is almost like 2 jobs. And so really delineating like time that you spend on your full-time job and then time that you spend on MCAT. And I know like it's very understandable that even as a student, I think there are things that feel really urgent. Like there's a assignment I have due tomorrow. There's a thing that I have to get to my boss tomorrow. I have a test next week. And so oftentimes the MCAT feels less urgent because it's very far into the future. And so making sure that you have a set amount of time that you build into your week that is dedicated only to MCAT studying and that nothing else gets to kind of impede on that time is very important.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions that are a bit similar. So Catherine, I think you'll probably take this. So the first one is, which math topics are tested on the MCAT, and the second is I was recently told there are no calculators allowed on the exam. For certain questions, does a calculator pop up on the screen?
Okay, so those are both very reasonable questions. So I definitely am not the person who loves doing math, never have. But luckily, the MCAT goes a little bit easy on us. So most of the questions you can solve using certain tricks, a lot of them involving trig, so learning your trig, sine, cosine, those types of things are very helpful for physics. In addition to that, being comfortable with scientific notation is a really big part of the exam. So if that's something that you never fully grasped, it's really time that you start understanding how to convert quickly in scientific notation, because that will save you a lot of time. In addition to that, there's a lot of dimensional analysis in chemistry topics. And of course, physics involves a lot of math, but mostly it's testing the relationships. So you're not going to have to plug in decimal places. What that means is there's unfortunately no calculator on the MCAT, but often rounding and some good critical thinking will get you to the answer without having to do a whole lot of crazy math. So that's your answer there.
Okay, so let's see what we have here. What books do you use in your prep course? So the MedSchoolCoach actually doesn't offer any MCAT books, and we actually consider this to be a strength, not a weakness. So when you work with many of the test prep companies out there, like the Princeton Review, Kaplan, Next Step, and so forth, when you sign up for any of the programs, they'll send you a big box with a full set of all their MCAT books. And these MCAT books are on the different subjects. So you'll have one for general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and so forth. Each of these books are written by different authors. And to be realistic, not all of the authors are going to write books of equal quality, which means with each company, some of their books are very good, but some of their books are not so good. So what we're actually able to do here is, instead of forcing a student to use an entire set of books, both the good ones and the less good ones, we're able to recommend our students to pull from multiple companies, essentially select the best books from multiple companies. So that way our students are able to use the best books that are available out there. Okay, let's see what else we have here. So Rashav, if you want to take this one. So the question is, except for the AMC practice test, what other practice materials are most similar to the exam?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned earlier that the AMC questions are the gold standard, but of course those are limited, and there's only so many practice exams that they offer. And so if you exhaust all the AMC materials, there are a couple other sources that have really good practice questions and practice exams. One of the ones that I like and that I used is Next Step. It's a company that offers really, really high quality practice exams that, in my experience, are the most similar to the what the AMC offers. And then if you want not practice exams, but if you want practice questions, like question banks, then there's another company called UWorld that has some fantastic questions as well.
Okay, great. Catherine, if you want to take this one, the question is, when do people typically take the MCAT? Spring of their junior year? Are there advantages to taking it at a certain time?
Yes, so there are definitely advantages, and it all depends on when you plan on applying to medical school. So some background on medical school admissions is that the process is rolling. So the sooner you get in your application, the better. The application process officially starts on June 1st. So if you want to apply that cycle, you want to have your score back before then to be as competitive as possible. However, it is possible to push into the summer your exam date for that cycle and still do pretty well in the admissions process. If you want to give yourself a lot of extra time, say you're not feeling so confident and you feel like you might need a lot of extra time, maybe you didn't do so well in your undergrad classes, start early, start a year in advance, give yourself a lot of time to study, and it'll pay off, because you never want to put yourself in a situation where you're taking an AAMC exam close to when you should be applying and you're not scoring where you want to be.
All right, great. We have a personal question for Rishav. So the question is, what did Rishav do during the 3 years of during his 3 gap years, and what was his undergraduate major?
So my undergraduate major was biology. I graduated from Duke. So after college, I spent 2 years working as a high school chemistry and physics teacher in rural North Carolina through a program called Teach America. And once I finished that program, this year I'm working at MedSchoolCoach, and I'm also working part-time as a research assistant at University of Chicago. Thanks for asking that personal question.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to note. We are getting some questions about admissions. So for those of you with questions about more specific to admissions, I highly encourage you to attend our other MCAT webinars held by our medical school admissions advisors. Those are perfect questions to be answering, to be asking them. Today, we're going to focus more on the MCAT. So next, Catherine, we have a question. Are there specific classes that should be taken before the MCAT?
Yes, so there are definitely a lot of classes that you need to take before you're ready to conquer the MCAT. So you'll need to take general chemistry. So most universities divide this into a total year. So a year of general chemistry, a year of organic chemistry. You'll also want to take biochemistry. This is a big part of the exam, and a lot of passages are based on biochemistry. And then, of course, there are just your general biology classes that you'll need. You'll need a psychology class, and a sociology class is actually very helpful. Even though you might not typically think you need to take that as a pre-med, it's definitely recommended for the exam. And also just challenging yourself in the humanities. So those CAR skills will be built up by doing difficult reading in all different types of subjects. So take classes you're interested in, and that will help build your skills for CARs. I hope I'm not forgetting anything, but jump in if I am. I think that's all of them.
For some students, they might like doing an anatomy or physiology course. Although it's not a requirement, I think it can be helpful.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So if you look at the basic MCAT prereqs for biology, it's just 1 year of general biology, but usually a year of general biology doesn't go into the material to the depth that you're going to see in the exam, particularly for some of the molecular biology topics or the physiology topics. So that's where students who are biology majors usually have a bit of an advantage because they have a stronger biology background, but of course not required because every student has their own strengths. So students who are English majors, for many of them, they don't have to do anything for the CAR section and they can get a 130 plus MCAT score. So everyone has their own advantages. Okay, so the next question here is it advisable to take multiple practice tests? If so, how often? So I'll go ahead and take this one. So one important thing to recognize when it comes to studying for MCAT is it's not based on how many things that you do. So I often get questions along the lines of how many hours do I need to study for the MCAT? How many practice passages do I need to do? How many practice tests do I need to do? And you should recognize that studying for the MCAT is not like completing a checklist. So if you every day you check off, 3 study items, and, by the time you take your MCAT, you've taken 50 practice tests, 10,000 practice problems, whatever you want to do, you won't be guaranteed any particular score. So really what's important about doing the practice questions and practice passages and practice tests is to focus on the results, right? Again, as Rishav mentioned early on, you want to take the MCAT when you're ready, and you'll be ready when your practice scores are around the target score you're aiming for and possibly above your target score. And if your scores aren't there, then you may need to take more practice tests. And also, when you're doing practice tests, it's important not to just do the practice tests, but make sure you're seeing improvement from the practice test. So that's why both Catherine and Rishav emphasize the importance of reviewing your practice tests, so that as you do more practice, you should see an upward trend as you do more studies. So there's absolutely, no requirement as to the number of practice tests that students have to take to do well on the exam. I would say at the least, though, students should take 4 practice exams, and that's because the AAMC has so far released 4 full-length practice tests. Okay, so next, we have a question for, we have a question about when to take the MCAT, and the question is, when is it too early? So Rashad, if you want to take this one, and the question is, when is too early to take the MCAT? If you want to apply in June 2020, is it okay to take it in September 2019?
Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, if you want to apply in June 2020, you can definitely take it in September 2019. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can't remember the number of years right now, Ken, but it's is it 2 or 3 years that you have once you get your exam score to use that exam score to apply to a med school?
Yes. So for most medical schools, it's 3 years, but there are some that are 2. So yep. 2 to 3 years is fine.
Yep. And so I think September is if the summer before your junior year is when you think you'll be most free, then you should study your summer and then take it when you're done studying. And I think that's not uncommon for students. And so I think that's actually a great strategy to take it this summer before your junior year.
Mm-hmm.
Or sorry, before your junior year. Sorry. Yep.
Yeah. So Rashad's absolutely correct. So that's what most students taking it over the summer are doing. So in terms of applying for medical school, it's generally advised that you take your MCAT by April or May of the summer before you apply. So any student who's taking the MCAT in August or September really are going to be waiting until the next year before applying to medical school. So that's completely reasonable. Okay, so we have a question here, and Catherine, you can take this one. This is asking for strategies for the car section. So any tips you can provide?
Okay, yes. So the car section is something that you might start out and be great at it already, and that's awesome, but a lot of us start out at a lower score. And it's something that we learn about different types of memory, and this is one of the types of memory where it's a skill. You actually have to do a lot of practice to build the critical thinking skills. So what I like to tell my students is that you have to learn to get into the mind of the test makers, because they will ask you these weird questions about the passage that you weren't thinking about before. But once you start to anticipate their style of asking these questions, while you're reading the passage, you can actually figure out the questions that they're probably going to ask you. So I work with my students to help them, while they're reading, actually pick out what questions might be asked and pull out the important details. So the biggest theme here is practice, practice, practice.
Okay, so we have a question here, which is it good to take multiple tutoring classes at once, or could that lead to confusion, as in multiple types of tutoring from different companies? So I would say we don't often have too many students that are coming to us looking for multiple tutors, as in, for example, if you work with a tutor from our company and a tutor from another company, that's usually not that common. I would say perhaps where that might work would be if you're already working with a tutor and you feel like that tutor is very helpful for certain sections of the exam, but perhaps you're looking for more guidance on other sections. So if you're looking for tutors for help with different sections of exams, that might be reasonable. I would say what's more common for us is students who are taking test prep courses, perhaps with large companies like Princeton Review or Kaplan, and are looking for supplemental tutoring. So we have a lot of those students, and it actually works out quite well because a number of our tutors, such as Rashad, have taken some of those test prep courses themselves. So they know some of the strengths as well as the weaknesses of those courses and can essentially help to supplement in the topics where the students need more help with. Okay. So we have essentially more questions than we can get to today, so I do apologize for that. But there are a few things that I do want to mention. first of all, if you wanted any information on these slides, if there was a particular part of the presentation then that you might have missed out on, this presentation is going to be uploaded onto our YouTube page. So you can look up MedSchoolCoach on YouTube, and you'll find that we have a channel. We have a bunch of different webinars that we host on the MCAT, as well as medical school admissions advising. And if you have siblings or you have friends that are already in medical schools, we also have webinars about preparing for the board exams as medical students. So please feel free to check those out. And if you have any questions about our MCAT program and want to reach out to us, our email is right here, info@medschoolcoach.com. So feel free to take that down and send us an email with any questions that you have. And with that, I do want to thank all of you for joining us today. Of course, many thanks to Catherine Rishaw for providing the fantastic tips and answering questions. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your evening.